The fire had been running for 3 days. It came down from the north slopes, chewing through pine and cedar, crowning in the canyons, spitting sparks across the ridges. Crews had been pushing against it with lines of water and chemical drops, bulldozing breaks that failed within hours. The forest was supposed to be gone by dawn. And yet, when the smoke cleared for a moment, something stood between the flame and the ash. At first Amelia thought it was a snag, a charred tree left upright, black and skeletal against the orange sky. But the shape shifted. Shoulders rose. A head turned. 2 ears caught the light. A wolf. It stood at the line where the fire met what had already burned. One paw on seared ground, the other on fresh ash. The heat bent the air around it, turning its outline into something wavering, unsteady. But the animal itself did not move. It did not flee. It didn't even flinch as embers swirled inches from its fur. The crews saw it too. A murmur ran across the radio, "Wolf in the burn zone," followed by warnings not to break position, not to move into hazard. But no one moved anyway. They were watching. Wolves don't hold still in fire. They run. They vanish. They know better. Yet this one remained, upright and silent, like a marker planted in soil that no longer belonged to anything alive. The wind should have roared. The fire should have crackled. But for a stretch of seconds, neither did. Amelia realized she could hear her own breath inside the mask. She could hear the tiny scrape of ash settling at her boots. But not the inferno ahead of her. The wolf turned its head, just slightly, as if measuring the wall of flame. Its eyes caught the reflection of orange, then the darker shimmer of smoke. Not fearful. Not wild. Just fixed. Then the wind shifted. The column above bent east, folding the fire away from the crew line. Sparks spun out into empty air and died before touching ground. For the first time in 3 days, the blaze slowed, staggered, and fell into itself with a suddenness that felt wrong. When Amelia looked again, the wolf was still there. Still standing. And beyond it, the forest was silent. The crews expected the air to choke them when the wind shifted. 3 days of burning had filled every canyon, every drainage, every low meadow with thick brown haze. Even with masks, every breath was supposed to sting. The smoke should have tasted like pine resin, tar, soil, and death. But when the fireline bent and folded back on itself, the smoke came down differently. It looked dense, curling across the blackened slope, pouring toward the crews like a tide rolling inland. Yet when it reached them, it carried nothing. No taste. No weight. No sting in the throat. Amelia lifted her mask halfway, testing. She should have coughed. She didn't. The air smelled of nothing at all. Not clean. Not burned. Just absent. Around her, others noticed too. One firefighter pulled his respirator free, frowned, then slipped it back on with a glance toward the wolf still standing out on the line. No one said much over the radios. Just silence broken by clipped orders, as if too many words might give the moment shape it didn't deserve. The smoke thickened until the valley below disappeared. Hillsides vanished. The blaze they had been fighting hours earlier no longer showed its light. The fire was still burning, they could see the red veins higher on the ridges, but everything in front of them was muted, muffled, almost erased. Amelia checked the monitors. Heat signatures were fractured, scattered, indistinct. The instruments recorded flame, but not the column. Sensors showed wind, but not direction. And the atmospheric sample line came back flat, as though the air itself had decided to stop carrying evidence. She stared through the veil where the wolf had been. The shape was barely visible now, just a silhouette in pale gray. Ears still pointed forward. Body fixed in place. Watching. The smoke kept rolling past, soundless and scentless, as though the fire had opened its mouth wide and released nothing at all. For the first time in the long week, Amelia realized she couldn't tell whether the fire was advancing or ending. And in the quiet, she understood, the smoke wasn't carrying anything because whatever it was meant to carry had already been taken. By morning, the ridge looked hollowed out. The fire had run its course upslope, leaving black timber cracked open like bones, soil scorched gray-white. The crews expected heat to linger, pockets of ember glowing red, roots smoldering beneath the surface, steam rising from damp logs. Burn scars usually stay alive for days. But when Amelia and 2 others hiked the line for assessment, the ground was cold. Not just cooled by night air. Cold. Their boots left shallow impressions in ash that felt damp though no water had touched it. The thermals showed readings lower than ambient air, as if the soil had given back not only its heat but more than it contained in the first place. Then they found the tracks. At first, She thought they were canine. 4 toes, deep pad, long stride. But the spacing was wrong, too precise, as if each step had been measured. The line ran straight down the fire line, beginning where the wolf had stood hours before. The strange thing wasn't the shape. It was the temperature. She aimed the handheld sensor at one print. The screen blinked, 6 degrees Celsius colder than surrounding ash. She tested another. Same. A third. Still cold. It was impossible. Burnt ground doesn't cool like that. It holds heat. Even days later, it should sting through the soul. But here the prints lay like frost patches, soft-edged, refusing to warm. One of the crew, a veteran with 30 years of wildland burns behind him, muttered, "Never seen that." Then stopped talking. The trail ran nearly 80 meters before vanishing at a stand of trees left untouched by fire. Perfectly green, untouched. Pines that should have been consumed now stood upright, sap glistening on their bark, branches wet with dew. The wolf's prints ended at their base. No turn, no scatter. Just gone. Amelia knelt at the last mark, her glove brushing the cold ash, and for a moment she imagined she could feel breath rising from the ground. Not heat. Not wind. Just the faintest movement of air that didn't belong to the forest, or the fire, or to her. It felt like the end of a step that had never actually lifted. The fire had stripped the valley bare. Hillsides were skeletal, every tree reduced to a blackened post or nothing at all. But in the middle of the burned scar, a cluster of pines still stood. Green. Whole. No scorch marks on the trunks. No singed needles. Even the ground at their base looked damp, as if rain had passed here and nowhere else. Amelia circled them slowly with Thomas and 2 others. They had seen islands before, patches spared by wind or terrain, but this wasn't that. There was no topography to explain it, no moisture pocket, no rocky outcrop that might have deflected flame. The fire should have wrapped this place clean. Instead, it stopped at an invisible perimeter. 10 meters out, the trees were blackened stumps. 9 meters out, charred soil. 8, still burned but cooler. 7, barely touched. By 5 meters, the earth was wet, moss clinging as if the season had never changed. The pines themselves dripped resin that sparkled in the dim light. Birds had already returned, small shapes flicking through the branches, calling like the fire had been years ago, not yesterday. Amelia touched one trunk. The bark was cool, smooth. Her fingers came away sticky with sap that smelled sharp and raw, unburned. The others looked uneasy. They didn't speak. At the center of the grove, she found more tracks. Wolf prints again. The same shape. The same long stride. Only here they weren't impressed into ash. They were damp. Pressed into moss that should have died months ago from drought, but which now lay fresh and pliant, like it had been watered all night. The line of tracks circled once around the trees, then stopped. No exit. No scatter. Just a pause. Amelia crouched and looked closely. The last print was deeper than the others, pressed in as though the animal had stood, waiting, at the very heart of the grove. She glanced up, following the line of trunks into the canopy. The branches swayed gently, but there was no wind. And in that stillness, the sound of the burned forest around her faded again. No creak of falling timber. No hiss of settling ash. Only the living green. As if the pines themselves remembered something the fire had chosen to forget. By afternoon, the crews moved deeper into the burn zone. The ground was gray for kilometers, a landscape of powder where once the forest had stood. Every step sent up soft clouds that clung to boots and trousers, settling again without weight. But the sound was wrong. Ash is silent. It crunches only when caked over soil or hides ember beneath. Here, it whispered. Each footfall released not a puff, but a faint hiss, like pouring sand into shallow water. Amelia stopped walking. She shifted her weight slowly from one boot to the other. The same hiss. The ash didn't just scatter, it slid back into place, filling her print with a soft rush, erasing edges. She crouched and pressed her glove into the soil. A depression formed, then slowly smoothed, grains flowing like liquid. When she lifted her hand, she could swear she heard it still moving, faint, like tidewater pulling back from a flat beach. Thomas knelt beside her, listening. It's flowing. Where? She asked. He shook his head. They set a small probe into the ground. It sank easily, deeper than expected, 40 centimeters with no resistance, then 60, then almost a meter. The ash wasn't compacted. It was loose, bottomless. And when the probe was withdrawn, the hole it left filled with the same faint hiss, smoothing shut until no trace remained. That night, Amelia reviewed the recordings. The microphones had picked it up clearly, a low, continuous shushing sound beneath their movement, not wind, not shifting branches. The rhythm wasn't random either. It pulsed faintly, like water moving through stone, like breath through an unseen cavity. The fire had turned the forest to ash. But the ash hadn't settled into silence. It remembered flow. And now it was practicing the sound of water. They saw it again at dusk. The wolf. It stood at the far edge of the burned scar, where blackened ground met the living pines that shouldn't have survived. Its body was lean, mottled with ash, but the posture was the same as before, still, deliberate, unshaken. Crews had reported coyotes circling the fringes in search of carrion, but this was no coyote. Too tall. Too heavy. Too certain of its place. Amelia raised her binoculars. Through the lenses, the wolf's eyes caught the last light of day. They didn't glow, didn't flicker with animal restlessness. They simply held. Watching. Not the crew. Not the forest. But something beyond both, in the direction the fire had come from. She expected it to turn away. To vanish into the green grove or melt back into shadow. Instead, it stayed while the light drained from the sky. Even as night fell, its outline remained visible, darker against the pale ash. The men closest to the line grew restless. Animals don't behave this way. They flee from fire, from noise, from people. They don't hold their ground in silence, waiting for nothing. Yet no one moved toward it. No one dared. When the wind shifted again, it should have carried sparks. Instead, it carried quiet. The sound of settling trees fell away, and even the hiss of the ash flows muted into stillness. The wolf lifted its head, nostrils flaring, ears sharp. Then it lowered its body slowly into the ash, lying down exactly where it stood. Not sleeping. Not relaxed. Just lowering itself as if the ground was the right place to remain. Its breathing was visible in the last of the smoke haze, slow, deliberate, matching the rhythm Amelia had heard in the recordings from the soil. The wolf was not fleeing. It was not trapped. It was waiting. As though it had already understood something the rest of them could only watch in silence. By dawn, the fire was gone. Not contained. Not fought back. Gone. The monitors still glowed on the command screens, mapping lines of heat that should have carried for days. But the valley lay black and motionless. No flare-ups, no creeping roots, no hidden coals. The burned scar looked years old, not hours. Crews scattered across the perimeter found nothing to do. They carried hoses over cold ground, checked sensors that gave them silence in return. A wildfire that had swallowed 20 miles of forest had ended without collapse, without rain, without cause. Amelia walked out to the grove. The pines still stood, wet with dew, their bark unscarred. Birds shifted through the branches, careless, as though fire had never passed. And at the edge of the ash plain, where black met green, the wolf remained. Upright once more. Still. She stopped within 50 meters. It didn't move. It didn't acknowledge her. Its gaze was fixed toward the horizon where the fire had begun, as if measuring something that no chart or satellite would ever register. The wind turned again. Not with heat this time, but with a coolness she hadn't felt in weeks. It pressed across the burn, down through the valleys, and for a moment the entire forest seemed to exhale. And then the silence deepened. Not emptiness. Not absence. A silence that carried weight, the kind that followed decision. The kind that told her the fire had not been beaten, only ended. Only after the wolf stood still in the fire line had the wind changed. Only after it refused to run did the blaze surrender. When Amelia blinked, the wolf was gone. No tracks in the ash. No movement in the grove. Just the faint rhythm of air in the trees, steady, deliberate, like breath through an unseen chest. The valley was quiet. And the silence was final.